and so I really wanted to kind of keep it open today, make this a safe space for everybody to talk about your experience in Evanston, experience that you've seen the kids in Evanston deal with, and possible reactions to those experiences, and what we can kind of do to try to move them all forward in a productive and effective way. You'll learn very quickly that any type of violence really results in some type of trauma, and it's how that trauma is handled and how it's addressed that really starts to figure out the impact and the outcome for the individual that has experienced that and the community that has experienced that. We're going to talk a little bit about the ACEs study and then identify how violence and trauma affects a child's brain. Permanently, what it does and how that looks in a child's behaviors and actions in school, in the community. And then we're going to talk about resilience and strength, because all kids have it, and how we as adults can really try to be that person to try and pull that out of young people so that they have the best possible outcomes. And then we're going to end with just talk about effective strategies and working with people who, particularly young people who have dealt with violence, trauma, experienced it, witnessed it, and what that looks like in Evanston. Talk a little bit of, again, the main prevention strategies and kind of what we're doing here in Evanston already. You'll notice as we go through, we do have a lot in place, but there's definitely more work that can be done. And then we're going to talk about the relationship between violence and trauma. The definition of violence from the World Health Organization is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Violence is a public health issue. It impacts the individual who's experiencing it, the community. It impacts the individual's community around them. And public health issues are contagious and they're preventable, and so is violence. It's contagious and it's preventable. It spreads, but there are things that we can do to try to reduce the amount of violence that is occurring. Kristen did an E-plan just a couple years ago, and violence is identified out there as one of the top 3 most important health issues that must be addressed in order to improve the quality of life here in Evanston. The others were mental health, which ties right into violence as well. So it all interlinks, and I think there's 3 broad categories of violence: self-inflicted, and then there's interpersonal, and then there's collective. Okay, and as you can see, the colored boxes down here show how much all of it overlaps. If you're experiencing one type of violence, many times you're experiencing multiple types of violence. So down the side here, we have physical, sexual, psychological, and deprivation. And psychological and deprivation go along with emotional abuse. And I'll define that in a second. But you can see many of the categories, if you're experiencing one thing, you're experiencing all of those things. So as we talked about before, it's layered. So if we look at the self-inflicted violence, that goes to suicide and self-abuse, self-harm, cutting, different things like that, eating disorders, depriving yourself of certain things for whatever reason that might be. And then you move into the interpersonal, which you have both like family and partner, which can go to child abuse, partner abuse, elder abuse, and then you have community, which I think is a lot of what we're trying to address and talk about here. And that's broken down into like acquaintance and stranger, right? There's violent acts that are perpetrated upon people that we know for one reason or another, and there's also things that are happening to complete strangers, people not even knowing each other. And again, that can be physical, sexual, psychological, emotional. And then collective, I think a little more in this political climate and everything that we're dealing with now, you can see more of the collective violence that is happening against people, and that's broken down into social, political, and economic. when you, like a form of violence such as withholding welfare from individuals who are in poverty, right? You look at poverty, this is right now like a state issue that is a collective form of violence to those individuals who are experiencing poverty. So it's loaded, and we're going to break it down a little bit more, but I really just wanted to show the visual of how once you have one thing, you really see the layers of different violence that people are experiencing. So, according to the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, the definition of physical violence is non-accidental use of force that results in bodily injury, pain, or impairment. Physical violence, I think, is one of the most obvious forms of violence. You see it, there can be marks from it. There's hitting, slapping, punching. That's when you see weapon violence, knives, guns, different things like this. Any type of bullying can fall into this category. Bullying can fall into a lot of categories, which is a huge thing amongst our youth and beyond these days. And then you have sexual violence, which is defined as any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, unwanted sexual comments or advances, or acts to traffic or otherwise directed against a person's sexuality, using coercion by any person regardless of their relation to the victim in any setting. So there's a lot of different examples of sexual violence. I think one of the most obvious that comes to mind is any type of rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and it can go to anything: exhibitionism, voyeurism, peeping toms. I mean, there's all different forms and different levels of sexual violence. And then we move into something that isn't as obvious and that is harder to detect, and that's the psychological and emotional violence. Any act including confinement, isolation, verbal assault, humiliation, intimidation, infantilization, or any other treatment which may diminish the sense of identity, dignity, and self-worth. So when we look at this, it is much more difficult to detect than some type of physical abuse situation. This also can encompass bullying. This can encompass, it is just as devastating as any other type of abuse. And I can say that the Moran Center, we obviously see a lot of physical abuse, that comes through, but one of the most detrimental things that we're seeing in all the clients that get to us, and generally when they get to us, is because they've been involved in the court system, is this psychological and emotional abuse, and crossed over with mental health issues that a lot of the times came from this violence and this trauma and this abuse. So it can destroy relationships, it can destroy friendships, and even your own relationship with yourself. So a lot of this goes back to this self-confidence and self-worth. And if you don't feel that you're important and you don't feel that you deserve things, then you're hurt people. And that's where you're going to see this cycle continue. And so while every piece of violence is devastating, this one is something that is you got to dig a little deeper to get to, and it's not as obvious. According to the U.S. Department of Justice Federal Bureau of Investigation, in 2015, more than 1.24 million violent crimes happened in the U.S. More than 50,000 people die each year from violence-related injuries. And homicide is the second leading cause of death for persons aged 15 to 24. And the third leading cause of death for persons aged 10 to 14. So we're talking about babies. We're talking about young people. And again, a lot of this is layered. So it's resulting in this physical violence that probably below it is other, we'll get into trauma, but other types of psychological, emotional, different things going on in the community, poverty, mental health issues, substance. I mean, there's so many things and there's so many layers, but until we recognize that and identify those things, you can't get to trying to solve how to make it better. So I liked this picture from the Bridge Builders that they put on the flyer, because it really, well, it doesn't encompass everything, obviously, that falls under those, it again shows how everything overlaps. You see bullying in 3 different categories on here. You see just things just as rumors and insults and different things that can do microaggressions. When it comes to racism and different things like this, everything is overlapping into multiple different layers of experiencing trauma. I just kind of want to hear from you guys how you see some of this play out in the Evanston community, whether it's as parents, whether it's as teachers, however anybody's involved. Kind of your reaction to this and how we see these types of things happening in the Evanston community.
Well, I'm an Evanstonian, so I've been here since a young one. I wasn't born here, but came very young. And so I remember when kind of thing, right? So when the biggest thing that happened was, I remember this guy, Greg Nash, set fire to a lumber yard, and that was like, oh my God, he did what? Or, it was just like unheard of to have any real violence going on. Really, we're talking about back in the 50s, 60s kind of time frame. So that's kind of what has just really brought my heart really pumping faster for my community and for our youth, and just with my education and life and all of that, and knowing what else used to be, all those pieces has brought me to this point of it's got to move from conversation to some sort of action to support our youth, because our youth are being so left out here to interpret all this. We have all these filters. They don't. They're getting the filters though from being exposed to, but just that safe space. So I'm really glad to be talking about the types of violence. I think that's so important.
I think what I see even more, we teach in the schools K through, not pre-K yet, but is the expansion of digital and cyberbullying that seems to be anonymous. And that really plays to the psychological violence and belittling, bullying.
Yeah, it's a big, I can say, again, with the population that we work with in the Moran Center, 95% of the kids that we end up seeing through court or maybe diverted, but it could have been to court and all that, a lot of this stuff is starting over social media. And it's because you can sit behind a screen and again somewhat be anonymous but not really, but
right.
there's not that same accountability that there is in person. You're protected by this screen, and you can be tough and you can be these things even if you don't feel that way out there, but then ultimately that generally comes around, and or somebody will mess with somebody from behind the screen that isn't going to let that happen out on the street. And so a lot of the things that we're seeing is this this bravery and this thing hidden behind the screen, and then that's resulting in things actually happening in the community, and it's resulting in little petty fights sometimes that start so tiny over something really small on the computer, and then it blows up into all of these different things. And so that's causing a lot of the violence and the psychological harm behind all of that. That's also, we have a school discipline program as well in our special education. So a lot of times when this bullying is happening or anything's happening online, then that's preventing kids from going to school. And then that's putting people in the school to prison pipeline. And then that, it's all just, it's very layered. It's dangerous.
Well, I think too, it's something that connects to, when I think about the number of times over the years I've had particularly teenagers say they felt like they had to do something because someone disrespected them. Mm-hmm. And trying to embrace this message in our community that you can never force someone else to respect you. The only thing you can do is earn respect by the way we conduct ourselves. You can't pressure someone into respecting you. So figuring out that issue about respect, and so many people feeling that a lack of respect and lack of being honored is who they are. Yeah. So I think as we think about messaging and strategies of what people need, a very core basic thing is we need to feel that we have our own dignity and that people honor us for who we are.
Absolutely. Kids know how to push other kids' buttons. They're trying to get a reaction out of you. And if you give them that reaction, then if you want to look at it that way, then they're winning. and you can only control what you do, what you say, how you react. You cannot control what the person over there does. That's easier said than done, and so we process that, but I think that's a message that we really have to get across, that you're in control of yourself, and that's the only way that you're going to be able to respect yourself. So if someone else is disrespecting you, how do you respect yourself, and figuring that out. And a lot of times once people see you respecting yourselves, then you're more likely to be respected. We say all the time, sometimes our mission isn't sexy. We're working with people who are getting arrested, or working with the offenders a lot of the time. Majority of that time, those offenders were at one point victims of one thing or another. And so in order to make the community safer, in order to do any of those things, we have to address what's going on with them and find ways to rehabilitate and to fix those things, and to help them realize that they're not their worst mistake, and they're not bad kids. They've made a bad decision, because that's a big thing too. Just I'm a bad kid. And if you think that you're a bad kid, and if other people are making you feel like you are a bad kid, that's what you're going to live up to. That's what's going to happen. So kind of goes into prevention. There's like 3 main tiers of prevention. Primary prevention is where we want to be, right? That's mostly where we want to be. And I have a chart on the next one that'll go ahead and show different examples of that. But this involves the actions and processes and policies that fix holes in the bridge that result in injury and violence. So this is getting ahead of it. This is doing the things that we need to do so that it doesn't happen in the first place. I think, that's where the goal should be, so that we don't have to get into secondary and tertiary. And then secondary is early detection and prompt intervention to control and minimize consequences. And then tertiary, it involves treatment and rehabilitation to reduce further complications. So as we just talked about, Moran Center is we have a couple programs in each one. So in primary prevention, we have our school advocacy program, which is trying to get in and make sure that kids that have special education, kids who are getting into trouble in school and have disciplinary issues, that they're getting their needs met in school, and that isn't the reason that they are not doing well in school. And the reason we even came up with that program is because 90% of the youth that were coming into juvenile court were struggling in school in one way or another. And so that program started just with our juvenile clients, and then over the past 5 years has expanded to anybody. You don't have to be involved in the court system, because every single kid that was walking in was not going to school, had been suspended and is now in alternative school, is having behavioral issues at school, is failing classes. There's always something. So that's an example of something in primary prevention. We talk about positive early care and education, positive social and emotional development, which is a huge thing, parenting skills, allowing classes to help parents, quality after-school programming, conflict resolution, youth leadership, quality education, which includes school-based violence prevention programs, which I think is a huge thing, is implementing violence prevention and trauma-informed care and all this into schools, because that's where kids are majority of their time. 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, that's where they are. And so if we're able to do that, I think that helps prevent us from getting to these other places. Social connections in the neighborhoods is huge. We're going to talk about the ACEs study in a little bit, but talking about the importance of feeling connected, feeling important within your community is big. And economic development. We've talked about poverty. We've talked about how that influences. So then when you get into the secondary prevention, and this is where I was kind of going through thinking of Evanston, right? We have some of these things. We have a lot of different mentorship programs. Mental health services, we have a lot. Access to those isn't always simple anywhere. That's something we need to continue to get better with. Family support services, and then the one that popped out at me is this conflict interruption and street outreach, because we have our City of Evanston team, which is amazing and out on the street, and we also have the YOU outreach team that we work with daily with both of those teams. But this is a level when at-risk individuals have been identified, and now it's kind of like before it goes any further, before anything happens, how do we intervene so that we don't get to this next level. And then you go into tertiary, which is again a lot of where the Moran Center functions. as mental health services here, and then successful reentry, and allowing individuals who have gone down that road some type of opportunity to remedy that and to get the services that they need in order to not continue down that road, and allow them a second chance, because ultimately it is them who will make the community safer if they get the services that they need.
One comment I'd like to make, a thank you, Tommy, for being here.
Yes.
Representing the community as well as the police department, because I've had an opportunity to spend time with Ed Gregory, who is part of the PST team,
Correct.
which is the problem-solving team. So really about being in the community and being a part of the problem-solving process, right? So I appreciate that in you.
Yes,
So
I did.
we used to have a program with the youth that we were working with at the Moran Center and police officers, and just trying to get them together in a room in a safe space to talk through things. And that went away for a little bit, but now it started back up again last year, because a lot of the problem-solving team is getting their MJ, their Master's in Jurisprudence at Loyola, and I know Commander Henry and Commander Moore at the time, he's now retired, but for their end of the year project, they wanted to do something they could bring back to Evanston, and really try to connect at-risk youth and youth who have had negative experiences with police officers, and police officers, to try to kind of repair harm and rebuild relationships. And so they came to us since we had done something similar before, and now it's been 2 years that we did a year of planning, and then last year was our first year, and then we are in the process of planning for this fall. And it's different than a mentorship group in that it is, you can't necessarily, a mentor you have to trust, you have to be able to feel comfortable and safe with. With this group that we're trying to do, that's not there yet, and so it's about relationship building, not about mentorship. So officers come in, no uniform, no badge, no gun. Kids come in, and it's kind of like this in a circle, and kind of going through different things. And I have to give so much credit to the officers and to the kids last year who came in and who did it. They're very vulnerable, very open, to a point that there were tears in groups, different things like that. And so that is a huge thing in helping with everything that's going on out on the streets too, is trying to build that trust between officers and kids out on the street, and kids are willing to do it, and the problem-solving team was the main people who were involved in Project Bridge last year, and I think moving forward, Commander Henry and Sergeant Korea's team, and it's been a great experience, and for our kids too.
And also,
Erica,
right?
Yeah.
Erica Barton is doing the peace circles.
Yes.
Right.
'Cause I know I've experienced a couple of those with the whole peer mediation, conflict resolution.
Right.
sort of,
And I think that was part of what was done also
Okay.
in the group that she's speaking about, is that they did a peace circle.
Yep.
Erica wasn't the person who led that,
Okay.
but she is part of an organization that they go out and they will help with facilitating a peace circle if a particular community or organization is interested in putting one on. So we actually did one for the police department just with the community a few months ago.
And I understand too that you all are actually getting cases from the court that it kind of, instead of going to the court, we do the peer mediation piece or restorative justice piece, right, with the victim
Right, so that
and the
happens
perpetrator.
within, if an arrest is made through the juvenile department, through our juvenile unit, if the case meets certain criteria,
Okay.
they will then look at doing restorative justice, which involves being a part of a peace circle. And a lot of times the officers that were involved, different members of the community will come out to be a part of that. And of course, you want to have the person who was harmed.
Yes, the
and-
person who's
right,
harmed
and the
is
person
there.
who's done harm. They're always there to come up with a resolution.
So if we drop over to kind of the relationship between violence and trauma, identifying trauma and complex trauma. Trauma is the physical or emotional harm with lasting adverse effects on functioning and on physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And complex trauma is the chronic persistence of trauma, right? Over and over again for a period of time. Child abuse, different things when it is constant and it is chronic and it is over a long period of time, that's complex trauma. So we talk about trauma, we talk about stress, and I think a lot of times people think stress and trauma, and they always go together and it's always bad, but there's different types, right? So there's positive stress. So that's a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevation in stress hormones. I always use this example when I'm giving a presentation, right? You get a little jittery, those types of things, but something you'll get over, you'll be okay. There's no long-lasting effects on that. Tolerable stress is serious but temporary, but it's also buffered by supportive relationships and having people around you that can help you and having some type of support system. And then you get into toxic stress, which is where this trauma and complex trauma comes in, is when it's prolonged activation of that stress response and of that system with the absence of any type of protective factor or any type of support system. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So one of the things that really started linking trauma to adverse health effects down the road. It was a landmark study. It is not the only one. It is not the end-all be-all, but it's one of the bigger ones that first came about that really started linking, it's called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which is trauma, childhood trauma, to later effects down the road. So this actually came from, it was in the 1990s, and there were individuals that were running an obesity clinic, and they couldn't figure out why individuals who were making progress and losing weight stopped coming. And so they started doing interviews of the individuals who stopped coming, and what they found was that overwhelmingly the individuals who stopped coming had experienced sexual abuse when they were children. And so they started thinking and linking this to adverse childhood experiences, and that being bigger and not being smaller was a protective factor. And it was a way to cope, it was a defense mechanism to deal with fear and anxiety and depression. And that is why, even though they were reaching the desired goal of losing weight, they were dropping out because they didn't feel safe. So they wanted to interview and look into more patients. So they used Kaiser Permanente's clinic and other individuals and ended up interviewing 17 and following long-term a little over 17,000 different patients. I want to make very clear that these demographics are very different than the population that we're working with, but I think we'll make the point that ACEs, childhood trauma, is universal. Everybody experiences things, but then in certain communities, certain areas, you're going to see more of that, and you're going to see more layers. So the patient demographics for this were predominantly white, predominantly middle class, college educated, and they all were a part of this, which meant they all had private health insurance. So keep those in mind while you see kind of what this ended up looking like. So it started off with 10 questions. These are the adverse childhood experiences that they are asking questions about. It started off with just 10 of them, the top 10, and then as time has gone on, they've added more, which include poverty and systemic racism, different things like that. So if you take a couple minutes and just look at the front, you can see the different questions that were asked. Also, let me tell you, as a mental health professional, when you are using this, you do not ask the questions this way. It can be traumatic just reading that, but these are the types of things that they were looking for. Take a couple minutes and just kind of take a look at those. You guys can do your own in your head, or if you would like a pen, that's fine.
I meant to say,
The prefrontal cortex
Yes.
also is diminished in size, but the data does show that with reversal of trauma, all of those areas can redevelop normally. So I didn't want to leave it with such a negative, like these kids are irreversibly changed. They actually can develop those brain components again. The prefrontal cortex being really important for, it's kind of like our super ego for like making good judgments about things. And so we often see that in our adult patients that we treat. If I try to train medical folks about complex trauma and how we respond, particularly with that, instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you mentality, because a lot of times if we react to somebody thinking they're kind of getting regressive in their behaviors or very childish, usually that's a sign that something traumatic happened to them.
Absolutely. Thank you. So 50% of this population experienced at least one, 25% experienced two, and 6% experienced four. And it also, which is one of the biggest things that really came out of this study, was that it proved that they are powerfully predictive of adult outcomes. And I think that's what, when I use this, when I think about this, that's what I focus on, is that piece of it. So you look at this pyramid and you see at the bottom, sorry if it's hard to read, but the bottom, it has the adverse childhood experience when you're younger. And then you move up to this disrupted neurodevelopment, which we'll talk about just briefly, kind of what happens to the brain when a child experiences that. And then social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adaptation of health risk behaviors, drinking, drugs, risky sexual activity, different things like this. Disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. So it's been found that individuals who experience more ACEs, more adverse childhood experiences or trauma, are more likely to get cancer, to have heart disease, all different types of physical health issues. Also, a lot of people say, well, if they're engaging in risky behaviors, then that's more likely to go up too. But even the individuals who did not engage in those risky behaviors were still experiencing higher levels of physical health issues. So here's like some of the different things: behavioral, and then physical and mental health. So talking about lack of physical activity, taking on smoking, drinking, drug use, missing work, being able to hold a job, those types of things. Severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide, STD. So you can see this is all over the board in regards to physical issues, social emotional issues, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD. All of this is related to and can be related to chronic and complex childhood trauma. So just again, go through, only a third of this population had an ACE score of 0, so 2/3 had ACEs. Increased likelihood of multiple ACEs when at least one was present. 1 in 6 had a score of 4 or more, 1 in 9 had a score of 5 or more. This is what jumps out the most to me. A score of 6 or more, on average, shortens a lifespan by 20 years. So when we're talking about individuals who are experiencing trauma over and over and over again, it impacts their overall life unless or until it is addressed appropriately. And there's all different ways to do that, which we'll talk about. So when a child experiences trauma, there's two main parts of their brain that are affected. The hippocampus, which the hallmark feature of someone who has experienced trauma is a reduced volume in the hippocampus. And that plays an important role in fear extinction and conditioning and stress response. So if you have a reduced volume hippocampus that you can't, then a lot of times these kids who have been traumatized, their baseline is fear. So something that may not set somebody else off or may not scare somebody else or may not trigger somebody else, that's their baseline. That's where they're trying to start from. And so activities such as trying to complete work in school or different things like this, their brain is on survival mode and not necessarily able to wrap their mind around the daily things that they're supposed to be doing. Another part is the amygdala, which plays a crucial role in emotional processing and the acquisition of those fear responses. The amygdala is the part that remembers your response to trauma in the first place. And so when you experience something that somebody who's been traumatized perceives as threatening, the amygdala is what pops in and how they reacted to that the first time. and how they reacted to that in their past. And so that's why oftentimes you see regression. That's why oftentimes you see somebody who you look at as an 18-year-old who is supposedly an adult reacting like an 8-year-old child. That's what they remember. That's what their brain knows. And trauma and violence, literally, there's trauma and violence can literally change a child's DNA, change it completely. So the 3 critical impacts, which part of what I just talked about, is the emotional brain becomes a survival brain. You're going to do what you need to do to survive. The alarm system in your brain becomes distorted, right? So different things are going to set somebody off who's been traumatized differently than somebody who may be able to actually function appropriately. And then the brain's inability to learn from experience. So trauma also affects the brain in a way. Something happens once, a lot of times we say, okay, you learn from your mistakes and you change it the next time. It's not that simple for somebody who has experienced trauma. Your brain has an inability to learn from that, and each time that it happens, you may react the same negative way. That's important to remember. We also know that children are resilient, and they have a lot of strength. And so there's a lot of different things that come into play, which are on the opposite side of your ACEs sheet. There's a resilience scale and a protective factor scale. And so you can kind of get, if you look at that, you can kind of get an idea of the different things that individuals need to experience in order to increase their resilience and in order to help them through a lot of these traumatic situations. Some of them that I see a lot with the kids that I work with are strong bonds and connectedness with parents or caring adults. Like we said before, just one caring adult in somebody's life, whether it be a parent, whether it be a mentor, whether it be a neighbor, whether it be, whatever that is, can make all the difference. Positive experiences in the community, so at school, church, synagogue, neighborhoods, any of that, need to feel connected to their community, feel a part of it, feel important, and like they're contributing to the community. It's a big piece of it. And then personal qualities, coping, resources, courage, leadership, mental health, help. There's such a stigma attached to everything, so that's something we're constantly battling is, when it's okay to say, that you need help or that there might need to be some type of mental health intervention. And that is a huge piece of it, but it's not the only piece of it. And I think that's where community comes in, and that's where caring adults come in, and all of that. What it all comes down to is really trying to work on shifting the culture and the attitudes of those who work and interact with children from this question of kind of what's wrong with you, why did you do that, all of this, to kind of what has happened to you. It's come from somewhere. There are things going on, and we need to figure out as adults, as community members, as parents, not literally asking the question what has happened to you, but keeping that mindset in approaching you, whoever they might be to you. We have no idea what anyone has been through. We have no idea how they responded or what resources they've had in order to balance that out. And so I think, as adults sitting here, obviously, I think keeping that question in your mind is in that what happened to you, and how do we figure out how to get to that, and to figure that out and to work that out is one of the most important pieces. It's a mindset more so than anything else. I did the ACEs assessment with all of my social work clients in 2016. Again, not just handing them a piece of paper, but in our different assessments that we do, able to do that. And we work with a very vulnerable population, but 96% of social work clients at the Moran Center report at least one ACE. 88% of them report 6 or more. That's our Atchison kids. Those are kids right here in our community. And as we said, 6 or more on average is 20 years off of life. So it's here, it's prevalent, it's everywhere, and this is obviously a very specific population, but it's our kids that are experiencing a lot of the violence and the trauma and a part of it. So that just kind of gives some context to a little bit of what ours have experienced. And the other thing, I guess, I just want to point out, so unfortunately, lately I've been spending a lot of time at Cook County Jail and at the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center in Cook County. And part of my role as a social worker is to do mitigation reports for our attorneys. And that's ultimately sitting down with the kids who are arrested and who go into court, and literally asking them to bare their souls to me and everything, and that's not an easy thing to do, and it's sometimes more difficult than other times. But what I can say is, and when we'll talk about strategies, this is where it comes from, and in providing that safe space and feeling safe and feeling comfortable. 99% of them do. I've had very, very few kids, whether they're incarcerated or they're not at some point break down a little bit and begin to trust. And there is, while they're all very unique situations and nobody's the same, it is the same stuff that ultimately comes down every time, right? We're digging into their family life, their school life, trauma history, mental health history, all of this, and you see the same patterns each time. And what that looks like, you see unresolved and untreated trauma, you see substance use and abuse in the household, whether it be a family member or that person, you see mental illness, and you see poverty and lack of resource and lack of access to resources. Those are the things that every single mitigation report, that I do, which is a lot these days, has the same thing. And so when individuals go into court, they are obviously charged with crime, and the state's attorney's job is to put on a case that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual did this crime, is guilty of this crime. As defense attorneys, we obviously are there as lawyers to defend that individual, and they have a right to a defense. But as social workers, there is more to that person and that than just what they're up there in front of the judge to figure out. And there is more to it than just our lawyer trying to get them the best deal that he can. There is underlying issues and reasons that they are there. So that's my job in this mitigation report, is while the state is putting on what's called aggravating, an aggravated report, so anything that they can against this person, my job is to provide mitigating factors that try to get the state and or the judge to look at more than just the alleged crime. It's looking at this person as a whole, it's looking at who they are outside of this, it's looking at their history and their past, and all of these types of things to try and say, hey, we as a community, we as adults owe this person an opportunity to get help, and then we need to find them that help, and that's my job in doing that. But just literally, I think the easiest way I can say it is to try to get the state and the judge to look beyond just the crime, which is part of their job, but also to see beyond that and see what could have led to that and what we can do, again, to make the community safer, which is addressing those underlying issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because what I think is great about it, it doesn't change whether somebody's found guilty or not.
No.
It's changing the sentence. And the idea is not like, that somebody may be getting them the help they need, like mental health services. But it's better for everybody rather than just incarcerating somebody to say, could we look at what are those core contributing issues? What's the root cause?
Right.
And if we would address that, we would save money as a society, we would make our community safer because we would be resolving problems, not just punishing somebody.
Yeah.
And so to me, the fact that you're engaged in that is such valuable work. And even that's something that if someone were a mentor to someone that maybe didn't still get arrested, there's a lot of people in the community can be playing roles to contribute to the reports and to be part of a solution.
Absolutely.
Even after the fact.
Yeah, we reach out to anybody that this young person identifies as someone who could be a support for them or could speak on their behalf or could, I did a mitigation report a little bit ago for somebody who was charged with a pretty serious crime. I had 32 character references from adults in the community that knew who this kid was, and that had a huge impact. And again, you're right, it's not about the crime or guilty or not guilty, but it's about what we can do in sentencing that'll help this child and also help the community. Because ultimately, majority of people who are incarcerated and go away are going to come back at some point. So our best bet is, for both their sake and the community's sake, is to do what we can to make sure when they come back that they've rehabilitated, that they've had the best chance of not going through recidivism, all of that.
being incarcerated, well, it's not on the ACE study, it's another traumatic experience.
Yes.
You know,
There's one on the ASA study, it was a household member incarcerated.
but they don't ask, were you, you know,
Yeah.
before age 18 incarcerated, and when you were incarcerated, or if you, maybe you were sexually traumatized, it wasn't on that. But I think it's such an important thing, so that's really vital work. That's really
Yes, I'm a mental health professional and I know my clients really well and all of that, but it is just as much the community's input and job in helping these youth as it is any of the organizations or counselors or things like that. So first and foremost, important thing that we've been talking about all day is creating a safe space. Individuals have experienced trauma, have experienced violence, are less likely to trust. And so it's doing everything that you can, and part of that is being non-judgmental. I mean, there's going to be things that come in that are hard to hear, makes people look at people differently. And so really putting out there that you're not there to judge what they've done or what they've not done, and you're there as a support and all of that. That's a huge piece of it. It can be scary, it can be embarrassing, and as we've talked about, there's a stigma attached to a lot of this, and there's a stigma attached to getting help. So that's another huge part where the community comes in, is if there's the stigma attached and they can't or won't bring themselves to see a professional, it's different to talk to a community member, and it's different to be able to engage with somebody who isn't a mental health professional and it's come sit on my couch and talk to me. You know, there's a lot of stigma that comes with that. So that's huge when community members come in. The other thing I would have to say, which could be the most detrimental thing, is never ever minimize a situation that a young person comes to you with. I think that's what happens a lot, especially with males. They come to you and there's something that has gotten to them, there's something that's bothering them, there's something that's happened in their past, and the person that they go to minimize it, or it's not a big deal, or be a man, or they, different things like this. They're never going to go to anybody for help because the one person that they reached out to acted like it was no big deal. And so it's not supposed to be a big deal, so I'm just going to block it. There's something, and I'm just going to block it and bury it, and then it's going to come out in other ways. So huge thing is never minimize it, doesn't matter how small it seems. They're bringing it up, it's big to them. Watch for early signs and symptoms of exposure to trauma, exposure to violence. I mean, those are all over the board, but it could be on one end, acting out, completely and behaviorally, getting in trouble in the school, getting suspended, things like that. Or it could be on the other end, totally isolating and withdrawing, oversleeping or undersleeping. This is something that if you notice a big difference in any of that, quick increase in substance abuse, lack of motivation, these types of things. And obviously they can mean a lot of different things, but these are some of the things to look for in somebody who's struggling for one reason or another. Seek mental help somebody if they can, or if they start talking to you, seek mental health treatment if needed. Mentorship and positive adult role models, which we've talked about, are huge. Why this group is here, it's great. Help provide a sense of belonging and community, help kids get involved in something going on, outside that they can feel good about, that they can feel a part of. That's a big thing. And oftentimes they want to and just don't know how to find it, don't know how to access it, need a little encouragement to do it. So I think that's a huge part that you guys can play. Pro-social activities to take part in, so same type of thing. We know there are positive coping skills and there are negative coping skills. A lot of times, if they don't have somebody else, they're engaging in the negative coping skills. So helping to think through what types of things they like doing and they can go to in order to kind of deal with some of the things that are going on in their head. Like I said, a lot of things that I do with my kids are things that anybody can do. Sometimes they come in and we go for a walk instead of sitting in my room. We go play basketball. Those are things they can do on their own too. They love that I suck at basketball. It makes them laugh. It makes them feel good. Like there's different things. There's different things, that and they are good. So basketball, baseball, we go do any type of thing outside. But the creative arts again too. Music is a huge thing. Whether it's just listening to it, writing it, because that kind of goes along with the journaling thing. Not all of them are so keen all the time about saying I'm writing a journal, but they'll write lyrics and they'll do poetry and things like that. That's all really helpful. Physical outlets, working out. We give a lot of our kids, we have free 7-day, so if anybody knows anybody, passes to different gyms and things like that so that they can go. It's not long term, but it's something we can try to get them involved in and then maybe try to get some type of scholarship for. But physical activity is good to get that energy out so that they don't go get that physical energy out in a negative way. And then again, just keeping in that mind is what happened to you approach rather than what's wrong with you. And then again, most importantly is really to listen. A lot of times all these kids need is someone to listen to them and not for us to project what we think they need or want or anything like that, but listen to what they are saying they need and they want. As adults, sometimes it can be really difficult to do that and to really hear what they are saying, right? You're listening to it, but really hear what they are saying. But it goes a long way with the young person if you're hearing what they are saying and what they're putting out and what they need, then you can help them, try to get that and not put your own agenda on it because that's what's going to empower them.